I just want to talk about if Joe Kennedy III is going to run for president. So Joe Kennedy is a congressman from Massachusetts, in the same states, obviously, where his great uncles Jack and Ted were senators. He's now 36 years old, 1 year older than you have to be to run for president, and he'll be 40 by the time of the November 2020 election. He's obviously the grandson of Robert Kennedy, and he's named after both Joe Kennedy, the father of JFK, and his first and oldest son, Joe Kennedy II. So like most Kennedys, he is a lawyer. He went to Harvard, and why I think he might run for president is I followed him on Twitter since he was elected to Congress in 2013. And they asked him to run for governor of Massachusetts in 2018, which he's refused. So that leaves really two options. He's either going to run for the Senate in 2020 or he's going to run for president. What I actually think of him personally, before this election, I didn't really care too much. He supported Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders in the primaries. Kind of annoyed me since he's young, but I guess he's sort of supporting the other political dynasty of the Clintons. And you know, Ted Kennedy disagreed with Clinton a lot, especially on healthcare, which is like a staple of the Kennedy like legacy now. Ted fought so hard for it before Obamacare was passed. But since Donald Trump's been elected, he's become very vocal, being retweeted by various celebrities, having many videos on his Twitter page. So I'm just going to play a couple of them and see what you think of these speeches.
His work on this. Mr. Speaker, after weeks of empty promises that he had a secret plan to ensure every American at lower costs with higher quality care, President Trump is now standing behind a House GOP repeal plan that was introduced last night that fails every single one of those promises. Based on estimates that we've seen so far, millions of Americans stand to lose coverage, out-of-pocket costs will skyrocket, and the quality of care will plummet. But today, hours after that bill was introduced, Mr. Speaker, our president referenced a to-be-announced second and third phase of his health care rollout that Secretary Price referred to as, quote, a work in progress. Once again, injecting our health care system into crippling uncertainty that is hurting patients and hospitals, behavioral health providers, and local economies. If you are so proud of this bill, why locked in dark rooms? Why not have an open debate? What are we so afraid of to have a debate on this floor? That's why I would urge my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans alike, to support my resolution of inquiry tomorrow to try to make sure that the details that have been discussed by this White House and by the Republican caucus behind closed doors are open for America to understand before we cram a health care overhaul down our throats. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield.
So he's obviously talking about Trump Care, which tried to get passed in March, which is, I'm going to talk about it a bit later because he made another speech today because they're apparently going to pass it this week. But here's him after Paul Ryan called it Mercy Care, saying it was going to help the American people. So one more speech.
Chairman, I was struck last night by a comment that I heard made by Speaker Ryan, where he called this repeal bill, quote, an act of mercy. With all due respect to our speaker, he and I must have read different scripture. The one that I read calls on us to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to shelter the homeless, and to comfort the sick. It reminds us that we are judged not by how we treat the powerful, but by how we care for the least among us. Mercy. Defined in purely secular terms, it's compassionate treatment for those in distress. It's kindness, and it is grace. There is no mercy in a system that makes healthcare a luxury. There's no mercy in a country that turns their back on those most in need of protection, the elderly, the poor, the sick, and the suffering. There's no mercy in a cold shoulder to the mentally ill. There's no mercy in a policy that takes for granted the sweat, the tears, and the sacrifice of working Americans that they shed every day so that they might care for their family's basic needs, food, shelter, health, and hope for tomorrow. There's no mercy for the 2.6 million people who will lose their job if Obamacare is repealed. This is not an act of mercy.
Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Washington State.
So he's obviously very eloquent. He's making a lot of good points there. And you can tell he cares. He's getting quite emotional in that speech. But what do I really think is going to happen is... the climate that has which the Republicans and Trump is creating could lead to someone like Kennedy to maybe rise through the ranks, rising up to 2020. But what I think is the senator for Massachusetts, I think, is Elizabeth Warren, who's quite a prominent, probably the second most prominent figure in the Democratic Party after Bernie Sanders. And I think it's a lot more likely she's going to run for either vice president or president, leaving the Senate open for Kennedy to run. And this is probably congressmen don't normally run for president as much as senators do, or governors. So I think this is the more likely scenario, and then he'll gain more experience in the Senate and then run in 2024, 2028, depending who wins the next election. And do I think he'll be a good president? Well, I really like, probably just because Irish Catholic background, like Kennedy himself, I've always been, I guess my parents have always told me about them, but doing my own research, I really like what JFK stood for, and more importantly, what Bobby Kennedy, his granddad, stood for. Probably one of my biggest political idols, and to a lesser extent, Ted Kennedy as well. There's a lot of romanticism to having another Kennedy in the White House, but at the moment, I think he sort of represents the rank and file neoliberal Democrat based on what he's done so far. He could be wrong. Like this healthcare stuff could be a changing point for him. But I don't think we need more people like Kennedys and Clintons who all come from this wealthy background. But his granddad showed that even if you're wealthy, you can still understand the plight of working people or black people, because he was a prominent advocate for civil rights. But at the end of the day, I would rather someone like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren to run and become president, because they will bring more of a change to America. I can see Kennedy becoming like an Obama figure. He talks a good game. I like what he says. He seems like a nice guy and everything, but he won't bring real change because he wouldn't push it far enough, because you're obviously going to get pushback from his own party and the Republicans if he went into a more radical direction like Bernie Sanders. But we'll see. He's only 36. Donald Trump's 70 now, so he could be around for a while and run when he's a lot older. I just want to play one more thing. I hope it works. From Twitter. He's doing another speech today, so just listen to one more.
Mr. Speaker, what this legislation does on its surface is very clear. It makes health care more expensive. And the more you need it, the sicker or older or poorer you are, the further out of reach it will be. That's why doctors and hospitals and nurses and the mental health community and patients have spoken up and spoken out against this bill. But this bill doesn't just cut coverage and hike premiums, all for a tax cut for the wealthy. It codifies a worldview by this administration that is dead set on dividing America along the lines of the God of your prayers, who you love, where you come from, or your fate and fortune. We see it in their tax plan, in their budget cuts, in immigration policy, and now in healthcare. And a worldview that scapegoats the struggling and the suffering, that sees fault in illness, that rejects the most basic universal truth of the human existence, that every single one of us one day will be brought to our knees by a diagnosis we didn't expect, a phone call we can't imagine, and a loss we cannot endure. So we take care of each other, because but for the grace of God, there go I one day. And we hope that we will be shown that mercy too. It is the ultimate test of the character of this country confronting our chamber today. Not the power we give the strong, but the strength with which we embrace the weak. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Again, a very nice speech. And yeah, he could be using this situation to further himself, but he uses a lot of his religion. Obviously, he's Catholic, like all Kennedys, really. And I like the way he uses it, even though I'm not religious myself. But what's happening in America today is Trump Care. The one thing that was keeping Trump Care from passing was the really right-wing people in the Republican Party wanted them to get rid of coverage, or if you have a pre-existing condition, it's way harder to get coverage in America. But Obamacare kind of made it a bit easier. So if you have a bad heart or bad leg or something, it's easier, but they're taking it away. So one really horrible one is now if you've been raped, that's seen as a pre-existing condition and they can refuse you health care. So it's a horrible, horrible bill, and Kennedy's making a good stand there. And it's obviously a very good speech, so I think maybe could get a lot of support. He definitely win the Senate, president maybe one day.